fantastic friends over the years by working in this amazing place. So we're going to spend the afternoon hopefully reminiscing, time to catch up, to talk about our winters and our seasons working at South Georgia. But first of all, I better get the boring stuff out of the way. So it come as no surprise that the fire exits are located here, here, and here. I don't think we're expecting a fire test any time on a Friday afternoon, largely because there's very few people in normally on a Friday afternoon. But if there is, then make your way through the doors and out to the the south car park, which is that way. The afternoon is fairly fluid. I don't want anyone to feel constrained necessarily by the timetable here. But we're going to there'll be some sort of chronological order. So I think Andy Clark is going to kick off with the pre-82 considerations of KEP, and we'll move up to the present day with Kate and Jamie here on my left, as well as hopefully a live link up to the current team at KEP and also to Government House in Stanley. For those of you that don't know, and I recognise an awful lot of people here, but there probably are a few. I'm Mark Belchet. I was employed by Paul Rodhouse back in 2000 to establish the science programme at South Georgia, or to take the proto-science plan and get that up and running at the new fledgling station at KEP. But since 2018, I've moved, and I'm now working directly for the government of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, where I'm Director of Fisheries and Environment. So I really still have a dog in this fight, and very much use and rely on some of the outputs from the Applied Fisheries Lab, or the research lab at King Edward Point. But I would just before we start with the talks, would like to thank the people that have organised this today, this meeting. We've had a lot of IT support. Kate and Jamie here have been part of that as well, and Martin. We've had lots of discussions, but really all the thanks should go to Sue Gregory. Where is she? Right at the back there. Sue, stand up. Stand up. Yeah, there are a few IT problems here, but I'll carry on talking. Yeah, Sue is really the reason why we've all been here, and it's so far seems a very sort of slick operation. And Sue's been contacting you and dealing with any queries, whilst at the same time Sue and I have spent the last few months trying to get the new South Georgia Marine Protected Area Management Plan published. And so this has by no means been Sue's sort of primary focus. So I think she's done an extraordinary job in getting us to where we are today. Just a little reminder about King Edward Point. Obviously, it is a BAS-run station where a science programme, primarily a sort of fisheries and marine science programme, is run on behalf of the government of South Georgia to assist us with our management of the maritime zone and the marine protected area. It's funded almost a 50-50 split between the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, of which Chris is here. Chris, where are you today? Chris is at the back there representing the Foreign Office, so thanks very much for turning up. But also from the government of South Georgia funding as well, which, as you know, is funded through revenue from fishing, through the sale of fishing licenses, and increasingly through tourism, which are our two key and important businesses. Really, I mean, I would like to thank you all individually, but there are, many different groups of people here represented. Scientists, of course, for whom the King Edward Point facility is an amazing place to work. But I think it often is forgotten, all of those, the support that is given to the scientists to enable them to carry out their work, and the support given to the government representatives on the island as well, the government officers, of which there are a few from different eras represented in the meeting too. So the scientists, the base commanders or station leaders as they're known now, the facilities engineers, the doctors and the boatmen, I think all of you, it's great to see you here. And those are the people on station, but also back in Cambridge or back in Stanley. There is, of course, the logistics coordinators, the science managers, and then throughout the season, a whole array of visiting scientists, South Georgia government builders, People, for example, building the new wharf at KEP, South Georgia Heritage Trust, people doing the rodent eradication, the museum staff, and a particular group that I would like to thank, because none of us, or most of us, probably would never get to South Georgia without them, would be the crew, the officers and crew of the Pharos SG, which is one of the nicest ships I've ever had the pleasure to sail on. Possibly not the most comfortable, as I'm sure many of you will agree. Those 7-day trips to Stanley, I think the last time I was on one, I actually managed to break the cycling machine in it, taking a large swell. But without them, we wouldn't be able to function. And of course, we're a year-round station, so they come even when it's not very busy. So I don't think there's anyone from Pharos or from Workboat Services Limited in Stanley that are here, but really thanks to them for the past 25 years, making South Georgia happen, really. So I will probably slightly ahead of schedule. I think that's everything. But Andy, I haven't got both pairs of glasses with me now. There he is. That's a sign of the times. 25 years ago, I didn't need glasses. But Andy, I'll hand the floor over to you. So thank you very much and welcome. Is it just a matter of escaping them?
Sorry. You're all right.
Don't want to ruin anything.
No, it's not seamless. So which one's your talk? What's it called? That one there?
Yeah.
Brilliant. How are we going on the screen?
Showing on the screen.
It's there? Okay. Just set it online.
Right. Good evening. Good evening. Good afternoon, everybody. Time zone shift. I've come from Norfolk. It's a long time ago. Right. To follow up on Mark's comments, there are probably a few people in the audience who have no idea who I am. Although it says British Antarctic Survey on the address at the bottom, so make sure I can find the down buttons. Let's try that. That'll do. Return will do. Okay, so I thought I'd show a slide to show what my association with South Georgia actually is. I joined BASS in 1970. I wintered at South Georgia in 71, 72. So if you look closely on that picture of the wintering groups that was shown, I am there. And I did following summers, 3 more summers. If you notice, those are like 2 years apart. And I was scheduled to be at KEP the year of the invasion. But by some lucky chance, I decided I needed an extra year at home to write some stuff up. So I wasn't present when the Argentine invasion took place. I then moved further south, working with BASS and as guests with the Americans. I've been back to South Georgia en route. I did a visit with the Heritage Trust in 2009, which was my last sort of thing with BASS. And I've been back a couple of times on tour ships. So I'm going to take you right back. And I'm going to take you to the very first science that was done, as far as I know, on South Georgia. And that's this. This is the German International Polar Year Expedition, 1882. They came down on a ship called Moltke, and they overwintered in a harbour, which is now known as Moltke Harbour. And they did a wide range of science. The remnants of the station are still there. If you manage to land there, you could, with the eye of faith, you can see where they were, but mostly it's gone. And their main visit reason was to observe the transit of Venus. And this was actually a really important piece of science, because at the time, we didn't know the distance between the Earth and the Sun with any accuracy. And the way it was going to be determined was by timing the transit of Venus. And they needed as many measurements as far apart on the globe as possible. And South Georgia was the place they chose. Some feedback somewhere. That was followed by whaling and the discovery investigations. So Gripvik and Whaling Station opened in 1904 under Captain Larsen and initiated basically industrial exploitation of whales. There were concerns raised about the exploitation by the British government, I think partly because they were concerned that the whales might be being fished to extinction. But of course, the other point, it being a government, is that the whaling industry was being taxed, and the failure of a whaling industry would mean no more tax. So they funded a series of expeditions or investigations to better understand the system that they were fishing. To do that, they established the discovery investigations, And those investigations needed a ship and they needed a station. And so they built what was then known as the Marine Biological Laboratory. We know it as Discovery House. It was built in 1925, and I think it's testament to the building that it's one of the few buildings of that era still standing on the point. And when originally designed, it included a lab, living room, dining room, kitchen, workshop, and 6 bedrooms. So in other words, it was self-contained. And that's a photograph that I took in 1971. Those of you who know Discovery House now will notice that the arrangement at this end of the building has changed substantially from when it was originally built. This is a plan of Discovery House, the Marine Biological Laboratory as it was. And you can see basically that obviously the overall shape is the same, and you can see the position of the original laboratory there, which was deliberately positioned so that it had views of the Allardyce Range. Can't be many labs in the world that have a view quite like that. And I noticed it's good to see that that tradition is being maintained in the new station. The discovery investigations were of seminal importance in oceanography, probably second only to the Challenger expedition in the 19th century. It gave fundamental contributions to our understanding of the biology of the great whales, although that was mostly established from carcasses. There was some field work and marking as well. It really told us a lot about Antarctic krill. It told us a lot about Antarctic oceanography, and it established some of the basic premises of Southern Ocean ecology. It was really important. It started out on Discovery 1, Captain Scott's ship, which was modified for work as an oceanographic vessel. And that was replaced by Discovery 2, which was custom built, and they were supported by William Scoresby. And when I was there in 1971, 72, I was wandering around the old boat shed, one that doesn't exist anymore, just happened to glance at the floor, and the floor was made up of the 2 otter boards that still said William Scoresby on them. So for those of you who are of a more recent generation, William Scoresby is not the person who sailed an airship to the North Pole. He was invented by Philip Pullman using a name from a real person much later on. Between Discovery and Bass, we had a series of other bits of science that were done on South Georgia that are worth mentioning, at least in passing. There was the South Georgia surveys. These were effectively the mapping of the interior of South Georgia. The coastline had been mapped, but the interior was largely unknown, apart from Cole Larson, who'd been and done some preliminary work. The basic map of South Georgia started with the South Georgia surveys 51 to 57, led by Duncan Cass, who's the guy in the top right. There were other visits. There was some geomorphology done by Chalmers Clapperton in 68 because he couldn't get into Deception Island because of the eruptions. Another geologist, Mike Skidmore, worked at Stromness Bay and Prince Olaf. And then Stanley Green, who was then a botanist at the University of Birmingham, was persuaded by Sir Vivian Fuchs, then the director, to do some botanical surveying of South Georgia. So that was what laid the groundwork for what happened next, which is the handing over of the government buildings to Bass, which took place on the 13th of November 1969. Now, you might think that I am an old representative of those old days, but there is actually someone in the room who is even older than I am. And that's this gentleman on the right, Inigo Everson, whose name will be known to many of you after, as it's the name of the part of the new station. That's Inigo with hair at the handover. And on the left is Ricky Chin, who was the base leader at the time of the handover. That's a shot of KEP as it was in 1971, soon after the handover. Those of you who know the station, the area now, will be looking off and ticking off all the buildings that no longer exist. And key amongst those buildings is Shackleton House, which is the big bright building on the raised beach right at the back. This is Shackleton House. It was a building that Bass inherited from the government. It was a semi-experimental building. It was built on stilts. The rationale for that being that if there was an avalanche down Deuce, then the avalanche would pass under the building rather than demolishing it. Although I don't know of anyone who's ever seen an avalanche get anywhere near Shackleton House. So, but it was, I guess it's safety. As looking at the building as the first floor consisted of the laboratories, I'm working left to right on that picture. Laboratories, then the dining room, the small windows by the main door are the toilets, then there was a lounge and then more labs at the end. and the top floor was all the bedrooms and washrooms. Unlike any other Antarctic station at that time, it had the luxury of continuous running water. We didn't have to go out and melt snow or do any of the other laborious things that people at other stations had to do. This had running water most of the time. We inherited a building that was not that inspiring. And so in the second winter I was there, we took it upon ourselves to redecorate key parts of the station. And that involved, I think the technical term is liberating a large amount of material from the whaling station, which at that time was out of commission. It involved a large amount of tongue and groove decking, which you can see around the walls. On the lower one, you can see some lamps, ship's lamps that were removed. The wall lights were made from shell casings that were turned up and turned into wall lights. And you can see it was work in progress because you could see some electrics dangling down there. So it was almost at the end. I think the really interesting thing is you can probably see the copper bar, which thankfully remains, not in its full size, but is still present. And the roof in the bar there was a gleaming white, which didn't seem to be really very friendly. So we used the only thing we could find to paint it, which is copper anti-fouling yacht paint. We also updated the dining room. As you can see in the before and after pictures here, the after one has some more of that decking. We used up every last piece of decking that could be found on the whaling station. And part of it was also used to build a really superb single dining table. Sadly, of course, when it came to the demolition of Shack House, you couldn't actually take that anywhere. It was too big. It had to be cut up and demolished on site, which is a real pity because it was a wonderful. That isn't our normal dining. That was laid out for a buffet for a ship's visit. I mentioned the water supply. Originally, the water supply for KEP came from a small dam that was part way between KEP and Grytviken. But if you read accounts at the time, there were continual complaints that it wasn't very good. The pipe kept freezing up and so on. So it was decided to do two things. One was to clear the Boar Valley Dam, which supplied water to Grytviken whaling station, and also to a small hydro generator that the caretaker used at the back of his lodge. The main hydro generator was under Gull Lake, but there was a small one fed by the Boar Valley Dam. But that needed clearing out, which was an all-based job and actually quite dangerous. When it finally cleared, suddenly everything moved and everyone ran to the hills to get out of the way as the dam emptied itself. But it then cleared. But it also needed a new water pipe. And the water pipe came on Bransfield and was delivered. And of course, it's been through the tropics. And it's sitting in the hold in the tropics. So it needed unraveling and it needed to be left there for months as it gradually softened in the sunlight when we had sun and could be straightened out and eventually laid in a new channel that was cut that allowed us to have continuous water from the Boar Valley Dam 24/7. The person on the right-hand side is Mick Pawley, who took over as base leader from Ricky Chin for many years. We know, I think, at least a name. I think he still holds the record for the number of days spent in the field with a dog team out of Stonington. I don't think his record has been broken. He then moved from there to become base leader of South Georgia. Just a few, this is a short trip, so I've just taken a few sort of images from that time. Initially, our boats were two boats that we'd inherited from the whaling station. This is Lily Carl on the left. She was a whale tug. It was used for moving carcasses around the whaling station and had the benefit of a variable pitch propeller, so it would go backwards as well as forwards, which was quite useful. That's on a trip to hunt reindeer on the Bath Peninsula, and we were able to walk in the hills. I won't say anything more about health and safety other than we had quite a good time and we were able to walk quite long distances. The Kino was still standing at that time, the old cinema, and so we used that for badminton and indoor three-a-side football. We actually had a competition against the John Biscoe one year where the teams were drawn at random. So it was the officers and the crew and the FIDs and and that was quite a riotous night, if I remember rightly. Grytviken was somewhat different from what it is now. The jetty was still just about safe to stand on, and the three whale catchers were still afloat. You can see, as it says petrel, you can see on the top left, and on the bottom right are Albatross and Diaz, which is a photograph I took by climbing up the crow's nest of petrel to take a photograph looking down on one of the very few days on which it was calm enough and cold enough for some ice to form on the surface of the cove. Wasn't very frequent. All the good things come to an end, and eventually Shack House was demolished. And this isn't my picture. This is a picture from Golly, John Galsworthy, courtesy of Ron Smith. And that's just, you know, the careful rip. It was, thankfully, it wasn't smashed up with the ball. It was carefully deconstructed. And then I think bits were recycled. And then there are still, I think, stuff in a pit underneath. Some stuff was buried there, which wasn't going to be taken. But that's the demolition, the end of an era. So I want to move now briefly to something else. This is a deliberate quotation. This is a quotation from the last section of Sir Vivian Fuchs's autobiography of Ice and Men. And I think it carries a message that's still relevant today. We had a great time down there, but we have a reason for being there. And I mention it specifically because Sir Vivian Fuchs was the key link in moving BAS as an organisation from an exploration and mapping organisation to a science organisation. He started it. His successor, Dick Laws, finished it. But Sir Vivian Fuchs was the person who had the vision that it was necessary to make the change. And that was his last tour as director in 72, 73. That was in a party we had in Shackleton House. And that is taken shortly after us. He gave us an absolute rollicking for redecorating the lounge without permission. And then said we'd done a very nice job. So that was fine. So my job when I was employed by Inigo, who's in the audience, was to go down and start a new program of marine. BAS was already doing marine science at Sydney. The new event was marine science at South Georgia. And for the first year, we moved into the very same laboratory that the Discovery Investigations had used in Discovery House. This is the before and after pictures. That's a picture from volume 1 of the Discovery Reports, top left. And that's the lab as Inigo and I set it up in 1971. There are some differences. For example, there is a window that you can see in the Discovery one. There isn't a window here, it's a blank wall, and that's because they changed the configuration at that end of Discovery House, and we only had 2 bays to work with instead of the 3 or 4 bays that we had before. But a year after that, we were able to move into custom-built labs in Shackleton House. So this was temporary, as was the aquarium, which was set up in the old coal store in Discovery House, which meant, if I remember rightly, several weeks of really mucky work getting rid of all the coal before we could stick a temporary aquarium in there. But my job was to work on krill, and thereby hangs the tail, which some of you may be familiar with and others won't. The idea was that the project would be centred around a seagoing vessel that would be based at KEP. And this vessel was provided by NERT, designed and modified by a research vessel unit in Barry, and intended from offshore work from KEP, and was going to be delivered so I could use that for work at KEP. Unfortunately, it was refused a seaworthiness certificate by the naval architects. And so I believe it was never certified to go outside the Humber estuary rather than being seagoing, which meant a rapid rethink. So I was down there without a project to do, so we designed in conjunction with Inigo. We quickly worked out that there was a nice, interesting project to do on the local shrimp Christmas, and that's what I did. And we used one of the other boats that we had from Grytviken days as a sampling boat. It was a superb little seagoing boat. That it may not have been designed for marine work, but it was a lovely boat to be in. But we needed a new one, so we had an upgrade, again provided by research vessel units. This was the guaranteed unsinkable steel yacht. Unfortunately, in its first season, it sank at its moorings in a storm. And this is the recovery. And actually, the 2 people who were responsible for the recovery are in this room at the moment. Divers went down and used airbags inflatable to bring it to the surface. And this is the recovery of the Yolia. Thankfully, eventually, we went to somebody who knew what they were doing, and we went and purchased a dedicated workboat, which we called Albatross. It's spelt with a single S after the whaler that was tied up at Grytviken, not to be confused with the boat Albatross, which was used by Niall Rankin when going around South Georgia. And if anyone's read the book, it's a really interesting book. But this was deliberate to keep the 2 boats separate. And it was absolutely ideal for what we were doing within the confines of the bay. Quick run of what we actually did. We did quite an extensive range of marine ecology out of KEP, dominated by studies of the common local species to get a feel for what the marine ecology was like in that area. There was a botany program running out of KEP again as well, again with overwintering botanists, looking at the biology of the dominant plants that you would find around there. But there were also studies of processes, microbiology and colonization and decomposition. And there were frequent summer visitors who would come in either from universities or other institutes and do a bit of work. and then go back after the end of the summer. KEP was also a basis for fieldwork across a lot of the rest of South Georgia. And there's a lot of important geology done at that time. And the field parties were usually deposited in the field either by Bass vessels or from HMS Endurance. This is a picture of one of those, Bruce Mayer, who gave me the picture. He'd actually, the 2 days before, had fallen through a snow bridge on a crevasse and managed to haul himself out, thankfully, from Dave Burke at the GN knew what was happening. But he left his ice axe and his snowshoes at the bottom of the crevasse. He decided he would save himself and leave those behind. So that's Christmas Day. They're waiting for a helicopter resupply of snowshoes and ice axe before they can continue the geology. But that 1970s to 80s was a period when the geology of South Georgia was sorted out by a series of really important studies done largely by field work out of KEP, but usually we only saw the people at the end of the season when they'd come back, packing up the rocks and getting ready to go home. Geologists are summer jolly merchants. They don't winter. They only come down for the summer and then they go home for the winter and then return the next year. They're part-timers. There was also a study of geology of Hodges Glacier. More frequent of you, Hodges Glacier, it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. But at the time, it was a very important, nice little confined Corrie Glacier. And with the help of HMS Endurance helicopters, the hut was taken up and a wind generator was taken up. And there was a long-term study of the mass balance of it by a team led by Ian Hogg, who you can see on the right. It's a great place to go and spend a week helping out, actually. And the skiing at that Corrie, am I allowed to say this, by moonlight on your own, was really quite good. Bird Island Field Station also opened in the summer of 71, 72. And the key people there were Mike Payne, who was working on fur seals, and Pete Prince, who was the assistant. And as people in the audience will know, Pete Prince went on to carve a really remarkable career of his own as an ornithologist. He was a birder by birth. It was in his bones. Did some really nice work. But for that first winter, they would come and winter at KEP, except they then went off to the Bath Peninsula to do some preliminary work on the reindeer herd. So that's my quick run through. I hope I kept the time up, but I just wanted to give you a flavour of what it was like living at that time, the variety of the science that we managed to get done out of KEP at that time. But it's worth reminding, if anyone needs reminding, that South Georgia is quite a smart place.
Thank you very much, Andy. It's great to see so many sort of similarities with some of the situations we had in 2000 in the lead up to the reopening of the base. We're going to now invite Frank Curry up. Frank is the former head of Bass's admin and logistics in the lead up to the return to South Georgia to KEP by Bass. So Frank, thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Well, I must say it was wonderful to hear that from Andy, and it makes me feel so much better. As Mark has said, I was head of administration and logistics from 1989 1999 when I left for BGS. Prior to joining BAS, I worked for the Royal Navy for 23 years and for the department which ran the Royal Fleet Auxiliaries. And from 78 to 81, I worked as a fleet logistics officer at the underground headquarters at Northwood, basically programming the RFAs. Perhaps I ought to remind you, at that time we had something like 400 warships and I was programming 30 RFAs. Look at the situation today, terrible. Anyway, my purpose in addressing you, it's going to be a short address, is really I led the negotiations for the return of BAS to KEP, which took place, I guess, the year after I left. But it was the spring of 1999. The Antarctic season had more or less come to a close. Our two ships, the Bransfield and the James Clark Ross, were returning to UK. And I was spending most of my time negotiating the acquisition of the Shackleton. Have any of you sailed on the Shackleton? Was that good? Yes. That makes me feel better. Okay. Anyway, one day in the spring, I was called into the director's office. The director at that time was Chris Rapley, who succeeded Barry Hayward, who most of you, I'm sure, know as a biologist. Chris told me he'd been contacted by the Foreign Office with the thought that Baz might be invited back to South Georgia, and would I go and up to Whitehall and lead on the negotiations? In the room at the same time was my old friend Inigo Everson, who's here today, and Paul Rodhouse. I believe you're here, Paul. Good, excellent. And we talked. They talked about the sort of scientific program they'd like to see when, if and when Baz returned to South Georgia. Anyway, within a week, I think I was up in Whitehall in the Cabinet Office for an interdepartmental committee. Are any of you fans of Yes Minister? Well, it was a bit like that, actually. It was chaired by an official from the Cabinet Office. It was obviously under instructions to try to get something done. It was also attended by the Ministry of Defence and by the Department of Trade and Industry, which at that time controlled the science budget. And last but not least was the NERC, and you've heard about them, I guess. Anyway, the MOD led off, really telling us all their troubles about being run down from 1989 onwards, and the difficulty they were having in maintaining a garrison at South Georgia. I think initially they had combat units there, but towards the end there was a Gurkha engineer company, as you probably know, and they really wanted to get rid of this particular posting, which wasn't particularly popular. So at that stage, I was invited to say something, and of course, I said in principle, Baz would be delighted to return to South Georgia, and they would like to run a pelagic program there, based at KEP, but also including Stromness. So at that point, NERC as our legal owners were invited to join the conversation, and immediately they were very negative about the whole thing. They said NERC would only support the best science, peer-reviewed, etc., and this looked suspiciously like a program to support foreign policy. They were not in favour of it, and they didn't propose to provide any money. As I made it clear in my part of the conversation that we would, having reorganised the rest of the survey with Faraday going to the Ukrainians and Signy becoming a summer-only station, that we really didn't have the running costs or the capital required to establish a new station. So at that point, I was asked how much it was going to cost, and I said, well, I couldn't give an estimate before we had done a proper survey of KEP, which had been in military occupation for 19 years. So I was invited then to go and conduct a survey with my staff and come back with some figures. As I say, it was at the end of the season, and the only way of getting there was on the Falklands Guard ship HMS Montrose. So Don Taylor, who some of you may know, was the head of the building section at the time, and a surveyor from Mott MacDonald. The three of us went down almost the following week because the Montrose was about to depart. We were fortunate when we got on board that we'd taken our sleeping bags, because the only accommodation they had for us, because it was full of army personnel wanting to visit South Georgia, was on the tank top, which those of you who know about ships will know it's right at the bottom of the ship on the fuel tank. So we had an uncomfortable trip to South Georgia. But as we neared the island, the captain, who I'd known from my mod days, put one of his helicopters at our disposal, got us into Stromness, and we had a look around there, and we weren't terribly keen on Stromness. The old whaling station was still there in terrible condition and quite dangerous, and the jetty also. But we did find somewhere that a base could be put. And at that point, the ship picked us up, took us to KEP, where we were greeted by Pat Lurcock. Are you here, Pat? Excellent. Well, it gives me an opportunity 25 years later to thank you very much for your warm welcome and help in establishing the work that we had to do. We had a look at was it Shackleton House, the base at the time that was occupied by the Gurkhas. It'd been in military occupation for 19 years and wasn't in a very good state. So we decided almost immediately that we would like to put a station about halfway between the house and the jetty, a modern station based very much on the experience that we'd had at Sydney for about 9 or 10 scientists and other staff, generators and so forth. So at that point, we went back to UK. We did some calculations and came up with a figure, which is about 1.5 million, 1999 prices. And I went back to the Cabinet Office and presented the figures, which everybody professed to be shocked about. They included running costs as well. And the same argument went on. MOD didn't have any money, NERC didn't have any money, DTI didn't have any money, and of course the Foreign Office never has any money. So I went back to report to Chris, wrote a report for him, and the chairman said that he would convene a meeting in a week's time in which the matter had to be settled because that was the government's intention. He looked very worried about all this. Anyway, so I went back to Whitehall and Mike Richardson hosted the meeting in the Foreign Office, and going up in the lift was my colleague from MOD, and he turned to me and said, "I've got your money, Frank." And that was the end of the discussions. And at that point, I went back and got Don Taylor onto the planning and all the rest of it. And I'm looking forward very much to see what you did in KEP in the ensuing years, because I finished off with the Shackleton negotiations and then went to BGS. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Frank. Very interesting to know a little bit of the history in the build up to BAS taking on responsibility for KEP again after the 19 years. The next talk, the speaker probably needs very little introduction because I think anyone that was passing through probably from the late 90s, 92, from the 90s all the way through to when did you actually leave, Pat and Sarah?
I left 2017.
And Sarah, you were there? Yeah, so I think anyone over that time probably needs no introduction, but Pat is now going to talk about the, again, in the sort of build up to the return of BAS. So Pat, it's lovely to see you and thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. And thank you indeed to Frank there for explaining in much more accurate detail how I was going to try and bodge my way through how the whole funding and negotiating went, because it was a pretty fraught time. So yeah, for those of you who haven't met me, my name is Pat Lurcock, and I first went to work on South Georgia quite early on in the 1990s, back when it was under military occupation. And so I'm going to talk a little bit now about moving on, what it was like going there, living with the army, and how being there during the rebuild and the transition, what it was like. I was hoping to transcribe my scribbled notes and something a bit more coherent last night, but we fell in among good company and didn't. So I thought, oh, maybe I'll get up early and do it this morning. But we went and visited a friend that we haven't seen for a long time. So I'm going to pick my way through my scribbled notes from about a week ago. And you'll be glad to know there's no pictures either, so you can just sleep in the background. Right, let's just start the timer. Go. So what was life like with the garrison? Well, I moved down there. Well, Sarah and I were living in the Falkland Islands. I was working for the Fisheries Administration there. And after 1982, when the Argentines visited briefly and then were sent packing, a British military garrison was left on South Georgia just to make sure they didn't come back. And as the years progressed through the 90s, it became clear, well, and the 80s, but particularly in the 90s, it became clearer that the Argentine economy was improving. They had transitioned quite nicely to a bit more of a democratic government, and the military threat had decreased, as had military funding, and as Frank was saying, the military really needed to be out. So part of the civilianization process, and that's a horrible word, it sounds a bit clunky, but the point was, we're used to saying demilitarizing, but the whole point wasn't to get rid of the army so much as to move on to have a bit more of a relevant process, a group of people and activities on the island, which certainly we have all seen has been a big success. So they came up with the phrase of civilianization, which trips off the tongue. And that started really in the very early 1990s. In 1985, South Georgia had been separated from the Falkland Islands dependencies into a separate overseas territory of British, or it wasn't the empire in those days, it was the last little bit, but so it was a separate political entity. By the late 1990s, or 89, 90, sorry, they declared the ability to start charging money for ships coming in and collecting harbour dues and harbour fees, partly as a political thing, but also just to get a bit of money in to start paying for the administration. Part of that was to mirror what had been very successful in the Falklands in raising funds from the fishery. And so in the late 80s, they started charging for vessels that were fishing in the area, krill vessels that filled up with their holds with frozen krill, came into shelter and transfer that to cargo ships. And they thought, well, we could charge them money for that and raise a bit of revenue. And so the commanding officer of the garrison was given an extra task, as well as trying to train his men, keep them alive in a snowy environment. He also had to go out to the ships and do the customs paperwork. And the ships increased and increased and increased to the point where the commanding officer of the garrison was doing nothing but going out onto ships, issuing transshipping licenses, filling in customs forms. And he went back to the MOD and said, I can't do the soldering because I'm doing this all the time. We need someone in. So in about 1990, the people who were doing the advice to the Falklands on their fishery were invited to send someone in. So starting with Braddock Jones, a fisheries scientist and administrator, he went in and set up a very basic paperwork thing with a little laptop with everything you needed in a little laptop. So he went and did that, and then a couple of other people came through. They did just 4 months at a time, billeted with the military in Chatham House. And as they passed through the Falklands where I was working, they popped into the fisheries department and, hi, Craig, hi, Tony, who else, Jim Anderson, all the people I'd known. And I'd passed through South Georgia in 1985 and 1988 on my way to Halley and back. And at that time, Sarah reminded me recently, I wrote to her at the time saying, I've just been to this most amazing place. I don't know how, but one day I'm going to take you there. How that ever going to happen? So anyway, I heard about all this, and there was a guy from the Foreign Office down, and Rick, just here, I'd be quite happy to break my contract with FIFG and just go and do this. So 3 minutes later, the Director of Fisheries, Falkland Islands, walked in, had a word in his shell like Patrick. So we made a different plan, and I finished that contract. And then I went down to do a 4-month with the army. So that was a real eye-opener. We all, from the outside, you look at the army, they live a completely different life. And they're alien to us, annoying most of the time, because they're different. But when you go and live with them, you realise that they are human beings. They are mainly doing a 4-month rotation. Some of the signalers would do 6 months. So you go in, do 4 months, and go home. But they were already, so a typical deployment would be, there was one guy I remember talking to, he probably not even 20. He was married with a little baby. They'd just been displaced from UK, moved to Germany. And then he was told, oh, you're going to the Falklands. So he had to leave his wife, kid behind, go to the Falklands for a year. And when he got to the Falklands, they said, do you like mountains? I had no idea. Well, you're going to South Georgia. So suddenly he's in the middle of nowhere no communication. So the communications in those days were HF, shortwave radio, back to the Falklands, and they had a very rudimentary Inmarsat A satellite system, which was hellish expensive. So they were really cut off in terms of communication. There weren't any bars, there weren't nightclubs, there was nothing to do, nothing to do, nowhere to go, no entertainment to be had, the sort of thing that young soldiers like. But they were not enjoying being there. The main conversation was how many days left, and that got quite wearing. They had a Royal Marine landing craft operator, so he's an LC1, so that was his job, was to teach LC2s how to teach non-boat people to operate with boats in a military environment. So I had a top-notch boating instructor take me out onto the ships. They also had an ML1, so a grade 1 mountain leader whose job is to teach ML2s how to teach Royal Marines and soldiers to trudge around in little old wooden skis and camp in the snow and just stay alive, which didn't take very long. So I very soon found that I had a top-notch mountain trainer, a top-notch boat trainer, very good at doing it to ignorant people like me. And so I was able, with Tim Carr, who's with his wife Pauline, they were there by then on their little yacht. So we would go out and have great fun. The other great thing, by that time, when the setup had been put in, there was a massive Soviet fleet fishing, which is why the commanding officer was working all the time. That collapsed. So by the time I got there, we had a couple of ships. My first 4 months, I had 20 harbour movements in the whole of the 4 months, so very little to do. And all you went on and did was a little bit of paperwork, and then drank a lot of whiskey with the Russian captains of the ships. Very, very unprofessional, but great fun. So that was life. In Shackleton House, so as well as the little laptop, we had a big, anyone remember dot matrix printers? They were about that big, and they were as they printed. And a Royal Marine mountain leader appeared at 11 o'clock one night and then invited me to stop using that before he inserted it somewhere quiet. So I stopped that. At the end of the 4 months, I'd really enjoyed it, and went to MRAG, the employers, and said, I'd be happy to go back again. So the first person to go back again. And we'd also been thinking, well, it's really not ideal. Maybe we could change the accommodation. So whilst I was away, they did up the old post office on the jetty so that I would have separate accommodation, somewhere I could work and leave all my office stuff. And we thought maybe we could get Sarah down, but obviously it's impossible for females to be on ships, particularly in the Navy. That just wasn't happening. So my second tour, Sarah was still back in the Falklands until we got a lift with her on one of the cruise ships. And so that was near the end, so I extended to 6 months. And that really set the pattern then. One of the rare good things about the constant staff churn of people within the MOD and the South Georgia government was they very soon forgot that Sarah had been with me as a sort of favour. Oh yeah, Sarah goes down with Pat and we'll put them both on the ship. So that sort of happened nicely. So we both lived there, but it was really lovely working with the Army. Sometimes some of them really got it, loved it. There was a guy came in one day and said, Pat, there's a Ross seal. Crab-eater seal down on the beach. No, I don't think so. Went down, crab-eater seal. You never saw him, but he'd seen this seal, went and found the book. Actually, he went into the officers' mess where the book was, sneaked in, got the book, looked it up, and then came and told me. So we did have a crab-eater seal. So some of the guys got it, and that was really nice. But they were a long way from their family. There was less and less soldiering to do. The garrison got smaller, so they took out the infantry element, and there was just the support people, so the signallers, the boat people, the Royal Engineers. There was a logistic support for my job. So it was well timed to go. And as Frank said, there was a lot of wrangling. Bass said at the behest of, no, well, we don't need to be there. We can't afford extra money. So there was all the wrangling there. But in the end, a project came together. So the rebuild started, and I'm going to have to go back to my notes now. Yeah, so the plan was made to, the initial plan was for a greenfield site. So all those horrible old buildings, useless old buildings would all go, brand new buildings and structures went through, which seemed a bit of a shame for for the few of us there. We were very lucky that Jane Cameron, who headed up the Historic Buildings Committee of the Falkland Islands government, came to do a job for the Falklands, and we moaned to her about it. And she came and had a look around KEP and said, yeah, there's some very special buildings here, the old jail, the post office, the marine laboratory, Discovery House. There's a lot of important history there that really should be preserved. So we made ourselves quite unpopular with everyone and kicked up. And with the result that we made the job of BAS and everyone much harder to build in around these different buildings. Post office had to go, the big boat shed had to go on that spot, but we did manage to keep Discovery House and the jail, which have very special history. And the history is important when you're in a place to appreciate that you're part of something that goes back, because that means the work you do is going to go forward as well. You're not just there in your little bubble, you're part of the continuum. And that helps everyone focus more on the work they're going to do. So the history of a site is important. So we made that job harder for them. Yeah, so the rebuild started. So I'm a bit fuzzy on the details because I like to record things with photographs now, and it's easy. But in those days, it was expensive. And if I took a film, you then had to post it off back to the UK to be developed. It all came back, and you realised you'd set something wrong and it didn't work. So I haven't got many pictures, but I do remember the ship came in quite early, disgorged a whole load of vehicles with Ant Risdon came ashore to put all the vehicles together and park them up. There was a huge cargo ship with all the materials, the flat pack buildings, the antennas, the furniture, everything was coming down this big ship. But the jetty needed refurbishing first. So the Army brought in a massive, great big crane. South Georgia government paid for a pile driving piece of kit to go onto the end of it, and two huge I-section beams came in, pushed downwards into the jetty to make two big bollards. They connected it all up, pressed the button, and one of the hydraulic hoses exploded. Well, you can't just go to Screwfix on South Georgia and say, we need a hydraulic hose. Luckily, there was a fishing ship and a reefer in, and I went out onto, it's probably the Zakhar Sorokin, so a big Ukrainian trawler of a very old vintage of ship, and the Ukrainians and the Poles generally had first, second, third welders, first, second, third hydraulic engineers. They were forever fixing things. So I went and asked the captain, any chance of fixing our hydraulic hose? Yeah, no problem, bring it on. Brought it on next day, went back on, two brand new hoses made with all the right connectors, plugged it in, and they were able to put these pilings in with the two massive great bollards that went on top of it. So it really needed everybody to pull together and make this project work. But then we got that, was it Beluga Performer, was that the name of the ship? Big thing, biggest thing I've ever seen alongside KP. Came in, unloaded everything. Part of what it unloaded were bags and bags and bags, the big ag bags of aggregate, and they were really useful because they had to go around and build a wall around where the elephant seals were going to breed, because the last thing you want on a busy building site is elephant seals moving in and breeding. So they built the wall there, and then all the guys arrived, and the very, very, very busy summer started. So yeah, there were buildings going up, trenches everywhere, because there were new water pipes. You saw the water pipe there going in. That was old by then, so a new blue one came in. That had to go all the way around to Grytviken. Electricity cables from the generator shed right up to the accommodation. Wires for communication. Yeah, you couldn't go to the bar and wobble your way home without falling into a trench, so you had to be really careful. What else was going on? Yeah, so the building started. And we became allergic to the noise of JCBs beep, 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 reversing. They started about 5 o'clock in the morning and went on all day. The guys, Pete, JDSC there, all the guys from Morrison's, they worked like Trojans, long, long hours, busy dealing with the Army, who weren't very forthcoming in the rations department. Pete had to write back and get a lot more extra food sent in because the army were rationed for a few guys sitting around doing not much, not big builders building all day. So that was something that needed sorting. And so these buildings slowly came up. The long platforms were put on the cardboard tubes, full up with concrete, and that made nice first layer, and then you put everything on top of it. So foundations across it, and then the big flat layers went on. So as soon as the floors were in, Sarah said, right, we better go and christen where we're going to live. So we had our first gin and tonic session outdoors, al fresco, exactly where Carl's house was going to be. Oh no, that was Shackleton Villa up at the end. So that was very nice. Very, very busy, but a really amazing bunch of guys. The army was still there. They were sort of melted into the background a bit. So there were a lot of people around, but amazingly, the whole thing got together until at the end, all the buildings were built. The army got up and left, and then there was just the BAS presence left, and the big handover and opening ceremony, which was quite amazing. The great and the good came in, the director of BAS, Chris Rapley, was in, the commanding officer of the garrison, he was in, the commissioner for South Georgia, who is also the governor of the Falklands, Donald, he came in. So a lot of very important VIPs. And on the day the ship they came in, furniture for Shackleton Villa came in. So we were not only welcoming all our guests, but we were making sure everything went up there. So we had a top journalist, Michael Binion from the Guardian or the Times, was on his knees in our bedroom, flat packing, screwing our IKEA furniture together so that it could all be good. There was no mattress, so we just made the bed without a mattress, so that when people came round and looked, it was looking okay. I'm going to rewind a bit because as they unloaded, two very important pieces of equipment got unloaded as well. The first one, the buildings were a flat pack construction from a Swedish company called Top Housing. A whole load of Swedish builders came in as part of the team to put those together. And they needed this very, very important piece of equipment. The building was their sauna, which got put in, plumbed in, water attached. Once the sauna was there, then the building could start. Hence, the sauna is still there in KEP. And this was one of a number of buildings that was just in a shipping container, although it looks a bit prettier now. The other important building, before any building started, one of the builders, Simon Arkwright, he's known as, came in and was told you're not allowed to smoke indoors. No, I'm not having that. So he robbed a load of the new building materials and added an extension to Larson House. So that was Arkwright's smoking room, which has been a store, and I think it's a jail now. It's a den of crime since we've left. So Arkwright's smoking room was built. So that meant that we had it could go. And then on the day of the opening, the Swedes were at last not busy, so they were having a sauna, and everything was on. A bit of a last-minute rush job. There was a wind-powered electricity generator had been installed. Really important to move into the new age and start generating clean green energy before the rest of us were doing it. They also had water tubes on the food store, heating water with solar. But it was time to switch on the wind generator, and it's very clever. It had sort of furling fans. So if the wind got too strong, they would bend over and the thing would slow down. Unfortunately, it had been a bit too tight on time. They'd been put on the wrong way. So as the wind got stronger, they actually whizzed around faster and faster and faster, smoke billowing everywhere, naked Swedes running all over the site. But they got it sorted out. Unfortunately, the director of BAS thought it was personal. It had been done deliberately. It wasn't. Chris, if you're up there anywhere, it wasn't. But yeah, a really, really great party. And then the army left. And one of them, Murdo, who was the boatman, we were all walking down to the jetty saying goodbyes. And he said, just one thing. And he went back up the road. I didn't know what he was doing. He just went in and tied up his shoelace, came back down. What's he up to? And I realised he wanted to be the last one off. So that was Murdo Mackenzie. was the last one, stepping off the jetty onto the boat, and off he went. And then there we were. So it was, for me, a new age. The building went on, but and then more the following summer. But the Bass team, it's like being asked for you parents, which is your favourite child. You can't really say which was our favourite period of occupation with Bass, because we loved you all in different ways. You're all special, but it was particularly special that first winter because it was a new thing. So I'm so pleased to see, I think almost everyone from that first year is here, and I'm really pleased to see everyone else from the following years. Possibly, yeah, well, Ian's here. 2003 was a pretty grim year. That 2003 was a particularly hard year, which I think not many people in outside world appreciated, but we do. And I will just give a shout out for that team when we had the wrecks of the Lynn and Moresco and even Viking Bay that went on the beach. It was a very, very busy year, dealing with shipwrecks, dealing with everything that got washed off the ships, all the pollution, the people who came ashore that were very well looked after. And that really summed up for me what was really special about having the sort of resourceful people that Bass bring into these places. Rewinding again, including a lot of the Morrison's team, of course, had previously been Bass, and Morrison sort of cherry-picked the best of the best. Buy me a drink later. And so a really resourceful team who could dig deep and deal with anything that came up. And that was really, really pleasant. That characterised what it's been like working with British Antarctic Survey until I finished in 2017. So the work carries on. But yeah, I was very lucky to be there over that period, and of course supported by Sarah at all times as well. So thanks very much for your time. I think that was only...
Thanks, Pat. I do remember the near-naked Swedish builders quite fondly. I think they nearly killed Inigo that morning. We're just about to name a house.
Evening, everybody, and thank you very much to the South Georgia Association for inviting me to give this talk this evening.
So I'm going to spend the next
Apologies
10 minutes or so
that
actually
I won't be
going
able to
back a little
reply.
bit and
Also
going back to
encouraging
Andy's
the
point about,
Antarctic
really at the
Fish
heart of it was the
My
science.
name is Mark Belcher. I work
And,
for the government of South Georgia.
this isn't it.
Director of Fisheries and Environment. But
You've
for
got
18 years,
narration to it.
Oh, I shouldn't have. I can
It's,
sit down.
we could try and turn that off. Play narrations, turn that off. Let's see. Is this your talk?
It's a different talk.
But it's got the narration.
Oh no, I didn't know there was narration.
We get double mark.
Hopefully not. How'd you turn me off?
I managed it. Would you believe?
Excellent. Great. No. Okay. So actually, yes. Just to front up, I did give a little bit of this at the SGA the other day. So, damn it. Apologies if some of you might have heard some of this before, but this is the expurgated version. But really, I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about how the science plan developed. And again, there's a large number of people in this room, particularly Paul and Inigo, who I look to for sort of the inspiration about getting the science plan up and running at King Edward Point, because I'd come in from a postdoc on the Isle of Man, where I'd been working on herring prior to joining Bass, so I didn't really have a great deal of experience of South Georgia or the Southern Ocean. So it was quite a steep learning curve. Obviously, this is a recent picture of KEP, but we'll get back to this point. So really, first of all, why was there a need for continuing science? We've heard a little bit about why the military wanted to leave, because it was getting very expensive, but also the period from the invasion, the Argentine invasion in 1982 up to their departure in 2001 was actually an incredibly interesting and important time in Southern Ocean fisheries management. The invasion of South Georgia in early 82 coincided almost exactly with the Camlar Convention coming into force. It had been signed in by 20 plus members in 1980, but actually entered into force. And this was for the first time a framework which would enable the appropriate and management of resources in the Southern Ocean, because of fears that mismanagement of krill could lead to overall collapse of the ecosystem if it was continuing unchecked. And there'd already been examples from the late 70s where marbled rock cod, which is the red line there, very little data before that, I'm sure there were data before that, first recorded data where 400,000 tons possibly of marbled rock cod were removed from the system. And then throughout the 70s and early 80s, there was a sort of successive removal of different species, including other rock cod species and the ice fish at South Georgia, to the point where CAMLR quite early on actually introduced prohibitions on fishing for some of these species. But you can see that that period actually, where there was no scientific presence at South Georgia, was very, very interesting in terms of the resource extraction, but also politically. The military garrison were there. The CAMLR Convention had come into force, but as already been mentioned by Pat, South Georgia became its own UK overseas territory in 1985, and that came along with its own laws and its own ability to govern and manage its own fisheries. Shortly after that, as it could do as a separate territory, it could designate its own territorial waters and therefore have some control about the activities that went on in those waters. And then, as any country's sovereign territory is allowed to do under UNCLOS, another UN agreement, could claim a maritime zone out to 200 nautical miles. And within that, they could then issue or charge for fishing licenses and manage the resources within that under a sort of sovereign flag. But there was also this tension that the UK were very keen not to upset Argentina too much. So this was being done on one hand under a government of South Georgia licensed revenue flag, but also under the banner of CAMLR. So quite early on, government of South Georgia had agreed to manage its fisheries under the auspices of CAMLR, being able to do things that were stronger than CAMLR, but nothing that would undermine the convention. And then quite an important part of fisheries legislation for the government. You can see I've become a terrible faceless bureaucrat now, but it actually was quite an important piece of legislation for South Georgia that gave them the ability to raise revenue from well-managed fisheries. And some of the other drivers for a need for research at KEP were that there was a very lucrative toothfish fishery, often known as sort of white gold, so could charge very high prices for toothfish and for toothfish licenses. So that was an opportunity, if that was well managed, to have a fairly secure funding stream into the future, alongside other fisheries for things like ice fish and for krill, with the possibility of exploiting the squid there at the time, which Paul was very, very not necessarily keen on exploiting, but keen on the squid studies, but also crabs. We knew there were large numbers of crabs in the region. So there was potential for South Georgia government to have enough income to really pay for the station, or at least alongside the Foreign Office contribution to pay for it. But already at that time, BAS were heavily involved in CAMLR. Inigo had been deeply involved in this sort of origins of CAMLR and being sent to Rome in the 70s, Inigo, I think, and that sort of was part of the catalyst for CAMLR coming together, this sort of global look at Southern Ocean fish stocks. But BAS were already leading, and a lot of that research had been heavily involved in the regular fish surveys that were undertaken on behalf of the Foreign Office, and then later for South Georgia government, working with internationally with the Poles and others in the US. Bird Island was already contributing to the monitoring of higher predators with the seal and albatross monitoring, and things such as the incidental mortality of seabirds had become a very big problem in the fisheries early on in the late 80s and 90s, and obviously BAS were leading in mitigation there. And also BAS had very strong relationships with the group that were working out of Imperial College down in London, with John Beddington and David Agnew in particular, and Graham Parks and their spin-off company, Marine Resources Assessment Group. So BAS were very well placed to take on this new program of research to basically gear towards informing sustainable management of fisheries in the region. I've had a great couple of weeks digging around in the archives, and I found this document that was produced, the South Georgia Management Plan from 1996, to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office by BAS, and it gave a range of options for returning to KEP. including, and I thought someone had been taking this one at the bottom, that there was going to be an airstrip. Now, the military might have been expensive, but I'm sure turning over Hestersletten, which I think was the preferred slide, to an airstrip would have been eye-wateringly expensive. So I think that got ditched fairly on. But as Frank alluded to, there were a lot of discussions prior to me joining BAS of whether BAS should just go to KEP, whether they should go to KEP and Stromness, whether they should just manage the facility, whether they should manage the science program, whether they should have an ocean-going research vessel based down there. I think that was something else I dug out from the archives. But anyway, this sort of got not watered down, but rationalized, I think, in light of economic realities. And eventually, by the late 99, Paul and Inigo had sort of coalesced on pulling together a science plan, the first 5-year science plan. And this very youthful person from the Isle of Man was employed in May 2000 to take on the leadership and development of this science plan. And I was given a fairly hefty budget, which I hadn't had with a NERC postdoc fellowship on the Isle of Man, I can tell you. And fairly free rein to sort of develop this program, which had been signed off with the Foreign Office. And I had a great time just buying a whole load of things. I don't know if you remember my office, Paul, for the first few months. It was just full of shiny new scientific kit. And everyone wanted something. I mean, I bought a porta salinometer, which the oceanographers told me was critical. I think it was probably used once. But an awful lot of the other kit was great, and including having to build a marine aquarium. So I worked with Andy Binney and Don Taylor and others, possibly in this room, to source all the parts. And then Steve Brown and Jude and the first team, I think, spent an hour building the marine aquarium at KP. But anyway, the main focus of the science plan largely was the ecology of the target species. And at that time, toothfish and icefish were commercial fisheries and were of big importance. But also under this ecosystem approach to management, there was a need to obtain more information on the other parts of the ecosystem that might be impacted by fishing. So the bycatch, so studies on the ecology of things like skate and the grenadier fish or the macruids. And then, as I'd mentioned, there was also some interest by the Koreans in particular about developing a fishery for the 7-star flying squid, Martialia, which was this one here. There are at least 3 species of these stone crabs living at great depth in South Georgia, and there was some interest. There was a similar fishery in Chile at the time, and there's very little work had been done on these species at all, on their overall ecology, their fecundity, their growth. So there was a little bit of focus put on that as well. And we were also able, as Pat had mentioned, fishing boats were coming regularly into the bay. There were scientific observers run through MRAG on each of those vessels. So we were able to obtain specimens from the fishery to work on, which was great, possibly something that BAS scientists hadn't had access to before. But one of the interesting things, because krill fishing at that time disappeared, but it was at quite a low level, there was very little krill research planned for the KEP program, but BAS was doing the routine Western Core Box krill biomass surveys. The offshore biological program had been running for a number of years. And Inigo and others from sort of the BAS Core program had done field work at South Georgia, I think at Husvik, in the previous decade, specifically around krill. But there wasn't a great deal of that planned for KEP. So with this money for the new fantastic facility and newly inherited sauna, there was quite a grand opening ceremony that still frightens me to tell taxpayers that the RAF flew in a crate of champagne for the day that they dropped in the bay by parachute, which was all part of a training exercise for retrieving this. But the champagne that Paul and Chris Ratley are drinking there, with Donald Lamont behind, and the John Cliff, the commander of British forces at the time, who were the dignitaries invited, are in front of the plaque, I think, for the opening there. And then I think John Lawton was there also from NERC here. So someone mentioned, Pat mentioned, we did have Michael Binion from the Times there. We also had Karina Goss from the Penguin News. She was sent down to cover this on behalf of Penguin News. And this, sadly, Inigo, is the one picture that I managed to take of you on that day. It's crap, and apologies for that. But unfortunately, the comms at the time, South Georgia government was still quite a fledgling organisation. BASCOMs, I don't know whether they've not been willing to or been told not to, but the military took over all of the comms for that day, produced nothing. I don't think anyone ever saw anything apart from this article that came out in the Times and Penguin News, until I found last week in the Imperial War Museum, there is footage from the event, which I can show later. It's also rubbish, but anyway, this is it. This is Richard Cockrell. If anyone remembers Richard, I think his son went on one of the groundfish surveys, but he was one of the MLAs in the Falkland Islands and was representing the MLAs at the time. Anyway, so I went down for this opening ceremony in 2001, had been there earlier on that season in October. And between October and March, it was staggering how much had been completed and built. I could not believe the speed with which the facility had been built. I'd had the pleasure, possibly, of being invited into, I think it was called the Whalers Bar at Shackleton House when the military was still there. Went in, just 30 at the time, still a bit wet behind it. Went in to find a whole load of naked servicemen. What am I let myself into? Anyway, so this is the picture of, and it is fantastic to see, I think all bar one of this team in the room today, but this was the happy smiling faces of KEP Team 1 here, so yeah, great to see you all again. And I think that was just before the JCR departed to leave you alone for the winter. But I did manage to find the Penguin News article, and this is possibly the most insightful coverage of the event here. And I think this was staged in Bath before we left, didn't it? Great photo of the younger both of us. But actually, it's not a bad appraisal of the day. You can see Jude and Therese there, not changed a bit. But as I say, it was great. So the programme had been agreed. We needed to get a little bit more equipment. So the marine aquarium to enable us to hold the crabs and the toothfish and anything that was caught in the bay. So this was the aquarium in the early days. I didn't really have much knowledge of marine aquarium, but it was actually a really good facility. Those of you that used it, probably aware that Toothy was kept there for many, many seasons. Wouldn't necessarily say happily, but we had crabs, and we used to get specimens from the Groundfish Survey and from the commercial boats. The other thing was Quest, and Howie, I know you loved Quest very, very much. One of your favourite vessels, Chris, I think probably as well, but Quest was a Cygnus 28 that I'd been up to have a look at Scarborough in probably the summer before the base opened, needing an inshore boat. And I've spoken a lot to Tony North and Inigo about appropriate vessels for doing work in Cumberland Bay. And actually, this seemed to fit the bill. It had reasonable hydraulics. It actually had been a small stern trawler, as well as having a Spencer Carter net hauler and a P-post for hauling pots. So it was perfect for Cumberland Bay. But they did try and sell me a North Sea place license with it before we left, which I did say no to because it seemed a little bit unnecessary. But this, I will just about end here, and we can probably take some questions from the first speakers. But here, really, just incredibly fond memories of those early days of sort of exploring this new place with science that hadn't been done for about 20 years, but netting in the bay. And one of the earliest things that happened, actually, and I remember informing Tony North that this had happened, because prior to that time, when the netting in the bay, the tramonets happened in the 80s and 70s, there was no record of Patagonian toothfish ever being caught in the bay. And it was a regular occurrence from about February onwards. And I remember, I think these photos here, Simon, which is an iconic photo that appears in all literature, and with Jude and Therese there, these were it was so exciting to have these things from 40 metres to 100 metres, literally just off the base. And then, other people, Martin, I have to mention you as well. Some colleagues worked with me, I suppose, from boy to men, all the way through, pretty much from the early days of this project, and still working together now. So it was a great time, and hopefully the rest of the talks that we're going to have after coffee will give a bit more about the facility itself, how that developed, and then about the development of the science and right up to science at the current time. But I'll leave it there. But what we're hoping to do just before coffee is to... Are they now? Oh, sorry, I should have looked at the thing. I'm glad Sue, I mean, I'm always glad Sue's here, but she's absolutely great for keeping me on track. That's perfect time. It's 20 past now. I thought I was early. But no, good. We're not going to have coffee now. I've been informed, but Jude and Simon are going to take over and, yeah, talk about that first season. Thank you very much.
Reflections, personal reflections. Yeah. Beautiful. Oh.
Okay, well, yes. So you've already seen most of my slides already. Thank you to Mark and everyone. But so yeah, in fact, I did a PhD working on herring, partly in the Isle of Man, which is where I first met Mark. And then we were recruited with Therese as the first of the science teams to go in. And yes, well, some may say I still am, but I was a very naive fisheries biologist at that point. I, again, didn't know very much about South Georgia. But here we were, Therese, Jude, with Andy and Dom. So we were actually recruited quite late in the day because they were still building the station in our first summer. And many of the team were already there by the time we got there. But this was us on one of our first days in the Falkland Islands. Typical Falklands weather, it's always like that, of course. Before we got on the beautiful James Clark Ross, and off we went. And we were very lucky because we actually got a guided tour of South Georgia fjords because they just fitted the swap bathymetry system to the JCR. And we were taken on a trip mapping the seabed around South Georgia. I did not know how lucky I was at that time because I was, Sarah, you have said it several times, I was a kind of fairly serious, quite sort of motivated scientist. And I had joined BAS to go and do science at South Georgia. And here we were going around doing this tour. And it's like, I want to get to the lab. I want to start setting things up. I want to get my science going. And that sort of theme continued through the first few weeks we were there, because here was the lab, empty. Mark had ordered everything. It was all there in boxes. And our job was to set it all up. But I wanted to set it up, but of course, there was all these dignitaries and there was all this celebration. There was this champagne falling out the sky. There was all sorts going on. And I just wanted to be in there setting up the lab. I was well out of my depth with kind of all the kind of politics and everything going on around it. I probably still am. And whilst it's been mentioned twice before, I actually went one step further and generated an image of one of those great memories. ChatGPT, thank you very much. But I will never forget the Swedish builder in the leather underpants and the Stetson running down the road towards the burning bush. No, towards the wind generator. Yeah, I mean, clearly, as you can see, I could have gone a lot further than with making it more realistic. But I thought I was looking out the lab window, and that's what I saw. And I've been traumatized ever since. No. But so, as I said, we arrived and some of the team were already there, you know, already constructing and building the station. So when we were there, we started setting up the science. And I have this recollection of very soon after we arrived, you can see one of the grey ships in the harbour there, the military left. So there we were, all the builders and the military left. Then, very quickly, within a matter of weeks, it was last call. And there we were. So just in case anyone doesn't recognise, we've got John Blunt, who was station leader, Howie Boaty, we've got Andy, who was Jenny Mac, Therese, Darren, the only one not here, who was the doctor for the start before being replaced in Eric Henry, Steve, Jude, and me at the end. And yeah, and so I must admit, it was a very, very strange feeling going from all these people, all these dignitaries, all this celebration down to just us. But of course, we very quickly got into our routine. Yeah, of course I was going to show this picture because it has, yeah, it has great meaning for me in many different ways. We can get back to that in a minute. And so we started setting up the science program. And as Mark said, we had quite a lot of latitude. We worked a lot with the observers on the fishing vessels who brought us lots of samples. And we actually started to produce some papers, which for me was one of the things that came out of this, was that I think I learned how to publish my science while I was there. And I hope, Lloyd's in the audience, so I better be careful what I say, but I hope I keeping that going then. And then one of my other overriding memories was my very first visit to one of the cruise ships, the Kapitan Dranitsin, this Russian icebreaker. It was in the bay, and we were fairly new to station, and some of us got invited on board. Oh, great, this is exciting. So we go on board, and we're standing in the corridor, and they're in the lecture theatre, and they're having their kind of recap, and they say, oh, and by the way, some people from British Antarctic Survey have joined us tonight, and one of them is giving a talk. And everybody in the corridor turned and looked at me, and I'm like, I knew nothing. Well, I'd done some reading, but I'd been there a few weeks, so there I was. I stood up in front of them all, and I dread to think what I said. I hope it was roughly correct, but there we go. But of course, 2 years later, I'm actually wearing a staff shirt from the Explorer because the Explorer, again, one of the cruise ships came in regularly. And again, this is a very personal reflection because the ship came in at the end of my first summer, and there was a big party night because it tied up alongside. Of course, we all drank responsibly and stuck to 2 cans, nothing more. But it was a big night, and particularly for me, because I happened to meet somebody who worked on board that ship, and we emailed and talked for the next 10 months. And then I actually took a contract break so I could go out on that ship. When she came back in, she had a World Championship juggler on board, and they actually came to KEP and set up their barbecue on the balcony, and we had this guy juggling chairs. But of course, for me, the very happy ending from all of this is that unfortunately Steph can't be here today, but one of the greatest things that come out of my time at KEP, if not, well, sorry, the greatest thing. Sorry, darling. Thank you.
These are the greatest things that came out of KEP for me. When I was asked by Sue to talk about our first 2 winters, I was like, how on earth am I going to fit the 2 most amazing years into 7.5 minutes? So I took out all the things we weren't meant to do. And any night we had more than 2 beers. And I thought, that'll be fine. I'll do it. So what I thought I would talk about is like the things that I learned from my 2 years down there and what those things I still use today. So going anywhere new as a 23-year-old onto a small island, you're going somewhere new, you're going to have to learn the lingo, which for this speaker was quite good because it involved a lot of science terminology. So fatheads and the squeeze technique. That is how an educated scientist takes a noted theanid out of a tramwell net, for those of you who don't know those terms. And I still use translating science into policy speak in today's world. The second thing I learned was how to dress. So Bath seemed to insist that this is how we needed to dress every time we stepped outside. So as a Geordie, we're not known for our appropriate dress, but John Blunt, our base commander at the time, was like, we're going on a walk and you need to take this kit bag, and this is what it needs to encompass, like thermals and hats and ski goggles, and it was a cracking day. And it was, you're like, okay, off we go to Myvik, and just over the hill, we've got this massive rucksack. Anyway, we get over, we see the wildlife, it's lovely, and as we're coming back, the weather changes, and it's an absolute blizzard snowstorm. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and we literally had every single item of clothing from our bag wearing it. So we learned we need to take clothing seriously. And as you can see, from then on, we made sure we wore the correct PPE at all times, especially in the laboratory or in the doctor's surgery. The next thing we learned as a new team on base is that you're going to have to build things. So as a science station, the first thing we're going to build is going to be the bar. So this is actually mid-construction. And as Andy said, the copper bar came from Shackleton House. So it was repurposed. And I'm hoping when we hear from the new KEP scientists that are down there now, that they are still polishing that copper bar on a Friday gash to within an inch of its life. And I am also hoping that the birthday shirt, which you can see there, makes a regular appearance. I also learned a lot about history. So actually during my interview, Mark asked me, what do you know about, what's your opinion on the political situation in South Georgia? And I, as a 23-year-old, I just looked at him and he was like, you know, you have heard of the Falklands War? And I was like, yeah. Anyway, he gave me the job, so that was fine. So yeah, I learned a lot about the whaling station and about whaling and about overfishing. And my career over the last 25 years has really been about marine management and sustainable fisheries. And this really brought it home. This is actually a photo before the cleanup. And when we were actually, before they'd identified there was asbestos in it, we were allowed to have a little rummage around. And as you walked around the whaling station, especially the piggery, I remember really still being able to smell the pigs. You could really feel like the life that had been there. I also learned to be a plumber, as Mark said. So he sent down all his kit, but he didn't send down instructions. So thankfully, as you mentioned, Steve was much better at putting it together, and the beakers were just the hired labor of sticking together. I have now built a house, but I have to say I didn't actually do the plumbing myself. Did the rest, but not the plumbing. And we also had to learn to be ingenious. So how are we going to fill the aquarium with water? Well, first of all, find someone dispensable, right? That'll be one of the beakers. Dangle them at the end of the pipe while the water pumps in. But we made sure we always had another safety beaker on the shore watching for those Ellie seals that were like busy in their mating fights. Also learned a lot about the science, as Mark's already said, from larval fish to otolith reading. And I actually ended up doing my PhD on toothfish. So a few reading of otoliths here led to thousands of readings of toothfish otoliths years later. And this is actually the freezer full of the science samples from all of the fishing vessels that were in the bay. So Fred and I and Simon did an awful lot of fish chopping. But there was so much fish, we actually couldn't do the three of us. So we always just recruited the rest of the team. So I think between us, we were all the perfect fish filleters if you ever need one. And we learned fishing on the mighty quest, not just quest, the mighty quest. And again, health and safety, we made sure our life jacket toggles were tucked away at all times so they would never have an emergency inflate when the channel net went firing over the back of the boat. And, you know, I still use fishing today. I have my own mussel farm, so go out on boats a lot. So a lot of the days of time out there we've learned. But I think the big take home that I learned was that skate vertebrate left in boiling water overnight is the most disgusting smell in the morning you will ever smell. It was, ugh, yeah, definitely made me vomit. Tale of the first winter has to be about snow, and there was an awful lot of it. And we had to move a lot of it just so we could get around. So I have to say the tech team were great at letting the beakers drive the JCB, very brave men, but we also had to do a lot of shoveling of it. And we also had a lot of fun in it. So from skiing and snowboarding to staying over in huts and to snow holes and to climbing up it, it was just an amazing place to learn our wintering skills. Also learned a lot about the beauty and the fragility of nature. This is the Harker Glacier, and I know it doesn't look like that anymore. It's a real reminder of how climate is warming and things are changing, and Hamburg on the left. And what talk about South Georgia wouldn't be complete without the wildlife. I can't say I learned to love nature. I've always loved nature, but I learned to love it more. And some of the most amazing memories was seeing an Ellie seal pup being born just right there in front of us, and then seeing the first king penguins at Penguin River. Okay, no, that's not Penguin River, but I didn't have that picture. So yeah, it was just such an amazing experience. And finally, I learned that South Georgia really gets under your skin. And I think for most people here, they either have or will find another way to get back down. This wasn't during my first 2 winters, but I was very fortunate to be able to go back down on a dive expedition at a later date and just see that South Georgia was just as beautiful underwater as it is above. Thank you.
Right, I'll just better check here. Right, there are 5 minutes for any questions for any of the speakers here before we break for coffee and celebratory cake. If there aren't, I suggest we could break early, but I will open up the floor if anyone has anything they really want to get off their chest quickly, or is everyone wanting coffee and cake? All right, that seals it then. No, I think we're all desperate to speak to other people. I've just seen Matt there. I haven't seen yet, so be good to catch up. So coffee's going to be served outside, just in the foyer here. It should be all along the opposite side of this wall. There will be cake there. I'm not sure who's going to do the first chopping, but we'll decide that outside in a second. But yeah, see, I think we are due to reconvene in here at 4:15. So that's plenty of time, 40 minutes to catch up. Thanks.